The first time people noticed what Harlan Voss was doing, most figured he'd finally gone eccentric. For 3 weeks that April, his property on the south end of Garner County was filled with the grinding roar of a rented excavator. Neighbors driving past on County Road 7 would slow their trucks and squint. A few pulled over entirely. They expected to see him prepping a new field, maybe pushing back the tree line to expand his east pasture. Harlan had been farming that land for 43 years. There was always something being improved, but he was digging a hole. Massive, deliberate, carefully graded, right in the middle of 60 acres that used to grow some of the finest soybeans in the county. By the time word reached the feed store, the excavation was the size of a football field and deep enough to swallow a man whole. Most of Garner County had already drawn the same conclusion. "He's building himself a fishing pond," said Dale Pruitt, who farmed the cattle operation next door. "Man works his whole life and retires into a base pond. Can't say I blame him." There were quiet laughs, a few raised eyebrows. People shrugged and moved on. Before that summer was over, many of those same neighbors would wish they had dug one of their own. If stories about quiet wisdom and the people who keep our farms alive mean something to you, subscribe and join us here. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments. We'd love to know which corner of the world you're calling home. Harlan Voss was not the kind of man who explained himself. He was 71 years old, and he had grown up on that land in Garner County, inherited it from his father, and spent 4 decades coaxing crops from soil that could be generous one year and punishing the next. Lean, slow-moving with sun-darkened hands, and the habit of watching the sky the way other men watched their phones. He wasn't the loudest man at the co-op meetings, but when he spoke, people listened. He'd planted cover crops before they were fashionable and rotated his fields before anyone called it sustainable. He didn't have much interest in defending his decisions. If a thing made sense, he did it. If not, he stopped. So when people asked him what he was building, he gave the same answer every time. "A pond," he said. And that was all he said. Dale Pruitt was the first to voice real skepticism. He ran 300 head of Black Angus on the land next door and had watched the excavation grow for 2 weeks before walking over. "You're pulling productive ground out of rotation," Dale said. "That's good loam down there." Harlan nodded. "It is." Dale waited for more. Nothing came. Over at the Garner County Feed and Supply, Bud Eckerman, who serviced half the farm equipment in the county, shook his head over his coffee. "That excavator rental alone is going to run him $7,000, Bud said. "And for what?" Maxine Trotter, who had managed the store for 30 years, was more measured. "Harlan's done things that didn't make sense before," she said quietly. And then they did. Gerald Fitch, a retired conservation officer, looked out the window. "He's sizing it like a reservoir, not a fishing pond. That thing's going to hold a lot of water." No one paid much attention to Gerald at the time. What most people in Garner County didn't know was what Harlan Voss had lived through in the summer of 1988. He'd been farming for 15 years by then, and that dry season nearly ended everything. Wells dropped, ponds dried to cracked mud. He hauled water by hand for his livestock for 11 weeks straight and lost 20% of his crop. The debt took 4 years to clear. He swore then that he'd never be caught like that again. In the years that followed, he attended water management workshops, read university bulletins on watershed hydrology, and drove 4 hours to visit a farmer named Eugene Stahl, who had built a series of ponds in the 1970s that kept his operation alive through droughts that broke his neighbors. Eugene had shown him what never left, that a properly sited pond could carry an operation through months of dry conditions. Harlan had been waiting for the right moment for more than 30 years. He never explained any of this. People hadn't asked. The project did not go smoothly. The excavator hit heavy clay 12 feet down, burning 2 extra days. Then a hydraulic line broke and the machine sat idle for nearly a week, waiting on a part from out of state. His daughter Renee drove out one Saturday with a look on her face that Harlan recognized from her mother. "Dad, the bank called. You're into the operating line further than they're comfortable with." "I know," he said. "What are you going to tell them?" He looked at the pond, half-finished, waterless, raw-edged in the spring sun. The truth. The bank approved a short extension, reluctantly. Harlan finished the excavation himself, grading shallow channels along the north slope to direct runoff straight into the basin without a single pump or power line. No pumps, no power, just gravity and planning. What Harlan had built was what agricultural engineers call an on-farm reservoir, a farm pond sized not for recreation, but for survival. A properly constructed farm pond captures surface runoff, rainwater, and snowmelt that would otherwise drain away or evaporate. Positioned at the low point of a watershed, it can store millions of gallons over a wet season, then supply livestock through summer, feed gravity-drip irrigation lines, and recharge the water table around it. The key is scale. A pond too small fills and spills, wasting what it catches. A pond correctly sized to its watershed captures and holds. Harlan had sized his to hold roughly 18 million gallons. He'd lined the outlet with a concrete standpipe, seeded the banks with native grass to slow erosion, and graded shallow channels to direct runoff from the north slope straight into the basin. It wasn't a fishing pond, it was a water bank. Spring gave way to summer, and the pond filled quietly, late May rains and slow runoff from the north slope. By June, it held 6 feet of water, dark and glassy in the mornings. People drove past and figured Harlan was satisfied with himself. But that same June, Gerald Fitch noticed the creek at the north edge of town running lower than he'd seen in 20 years. Roy Caldwell, who ran irrigated corn 12 miles east, said his well was working harder than usual. The county agricultural report noted that snowpack the previous winter had been significantly below average, and that subsoil moisture was trending below historical norms. Old-timers at the feed store started talking about 1988. The birds were moving differently, pushing north earlier than expected, as if something was pressing them from behind. The air that July had a particular smell, dry, dusty, the kind that gets into your clothes and stays. By August, the county had stopped pretending. Crops that should have been tall and dark green were pale and brittle, rattling in the hot wind. Ponds that had been full in May showed muddy margins, then cracked earth. Dale Pruitt's cattle operation was hauling supplemental water at a cost that made his jaw tight. The extension office issued a drought advisory, then a warning. Wells dropped, some failing entirely by September. Irrigation restrictions went into effect across 3 townships. Roy Caldwell's well gave out on a Tuesday morning. The summer of 1988 had come back around. Harlan's pond was still holding 12 feet of water at the end of August. The spring rains had given it a deep reserve, and the sheer volume he'd stored meant the drawdown was gradual, weeks behind where his neighbors' ponds had been when they went dry. He had run gravity-fed lines to his pastures, watering 200 acres through the worst of the heat. His livestock drank without restriction. His soybean fields on the higher ground were stressed, as everything in the county was stressed, but his lower acres, irrigated from the pond, were producing. The pond hadn't saved everything. He was honest about that, but it had bought him time. 8, maybe 10 weeks of water when the rest of the county had nothing. In drought management, weeks are the difference between a hard year and a ruined one. Dale Pruitt showed up on a Thursday afternoon in September. Dale wasn't a man who let pride keep him from a practical conversation forever. He stood at the edge of the pond and looked at it for a long time. The water was lower than May, but it was there, wide, dark, full of reflected clouds. "How much you got left?" Dale asked. "Enough," Harlan said. A great blue heron worked the far shore, unhurried, fishing in water that had no business being there. "I guess I was wrong about what this was," Dale said finally. Harlan didn't answer. He just looked at his pond. That fall, the Garner County Extension Office held a public meeting on farm water resilience. Gerald Fitch presented alongside a state hydrologist. The room was 3 times as full as anyone expected. Harlan sat in the back row. When people asked him questions afterward, he answered plainly. He gave his phone number to 4 young farmers who wanted to walk his property and see the pond layout themselves. Dale Pruitt broke ground on his own reservoir the following spring. So did Roy Caldwell. By the next year, 7 operations in the county had built or were planning on-farm water storage. The county agricultural report noted for the first time a section on farm pond construction and watershed management. Maxine Trotter put a copy of that report on the counter at the feed store. Harlan never said he told anyone so. That wasn't the kind of man he was. But when young farmers stopped by to ask how he'd known, he always gave the same quiet answer. "I didn't know," he'd say. "I just remembered." There is a saying attributed to Masanobu Fukuoka, the Japanese farmer and philosopher. The ultimate goal of farming is not the growing of crops, but the cultivation and perfection of human beings. Harlan Voss never set out to teach anyone anything. He was just trying to protect what he'd spent his life building, but in doing so, quietly, without argument, acting on hard-won memory and patient planning, he gave something to the people around him that went beyond water. He showed them that preparation is not pessimism, that long-term thinking is not stubbornness, that sometimes the wisest decision looks, from the outside, exactly like a retired farmer digging himself a fishing pond. The land teaches these lessons slowly, and only to those willing to listen. What decision have you made that others questioned at first, but time eventually proved right? Share your story in the comments.